James was walking down the busy streets of the city, his thoughts swirling around the success of his latest deal. He had just closed another multi-million-dollar contract, securing his reputation as one of the sharpest business minds in the industry. Life had been good to him, more than good, in fact. It had been generous. He had built a life of luxury, filled with everything he could ever want, and he had earned it all with years of hard work, dedication, and a little bit of luck. As he strolled along the crowded sidewalks, feeling the autumn chill in the air, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. But something strange caught his eye. Near the entrance of a local shelter, a man sat quietly on a bench. He was hunched over, his clothes worn and tattered, his face weary, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. James glanced at him without much thought at first. There were many like him in the city, people down on their luck, struggling to get by. But then, something about the man struck him. His face. It was familiar. James slowed down, his curiosity piqued, and looked again, more closely this time. That's when it hit him like a wave. The man sitting there, shivering slightly in the cold, wasn't just anyone. It was Mark, his best friend from high school, the person who had been there through all of James's formative years, the one who had made him laugh the hardest and had been by his side through thick and thin. They had been inseparable back in the day, two boys with dreams of changing the world. But life, as it often does, had taken them on different paths. James had pursued business, climbing the corporate ladder until he was on top, while Mark had disappeared somewhere along the way, fading into the background of James's fast-paced life. James stood frozen for a moment, stunned. The memories of their youth flooded back, football games, late-night conversations about the future, and the wild plans they had made to conquer the world together. But now, here was Mark, sitting alone at a shelter, a shadow of the vibrant, ambitious friend James once knew. How could this be? What had happened to him? Without thinking, James crossed the street, his heart pounding. A million thoughts raced through his mind as he approached the bench. What should he say? How would Mark react? He wasn't even sure if Mark would remember him. After all, years had passed and people change. "Mark," James said hesitantly, standing a few feet away. The man on the bench lifted his head slowly, and as his tired eyes met James, a flicker of recognition sparked in them. Mark's face, though weathered by time and hardship, softened with surprise. "James?" Mark's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much in days. "Is that really you?" James couldn't believe it. He hadn't seen Mark in years, and yet here he was, sitting in front of him, looking completely different from the energetic, hopeful young man he once knew. But behind the weariness, behind the lines of stress and the tired eyes, James could still see the spark of his old friend. "Yeah, it's me," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. He felt a wave of emotions hit him all at once. Sadness, disbelief, guilt for losing touch with someone who had meant so much to him. "What? What are you doing here?" Mark chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "It's a long story," he said, looking down at his hands. "I guess life didn't turn out quite the way I planned." James felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to ask more, to know everything, but he also didn't want to overwhelm Mark. So instead, he simply sat down on the bench next to him, letting the silence linger between them for a moment. "I never thought I'd see you again," Mark said after a long pause, his voice low and thoughtful. "I figured you were off somewhere living the high life, and I was right." James didn't know what to say. He was living the high life, but how could he enjoy that now, knowing his old friend was struggling like this? He glanced around at the shelter, the people milling about, their faces tired and worn from a life of hardship. Mark didn't belong here. At least, not the Mark he remembered. As the shock of seeing Mark wore off, James found his voice again. "Come on, let's grab a coffee," he suggested. We have a lot to talk about." Mark hesitated, glancing toward the shelter as if unsure whether he could leave. "I don't know, James. This is my life now." "Just for a while," James urged. "It's been too long. We can catch up, like old times." Reluctantly, Mark nodded. The two of them stood up, walking side by side down the street, though it felt like they were walking through time itself. James could see the fatigue in Mark's step, the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. This was not the life Mark had deserved. As they sat in a small cafe nearby, the warmth of the room and the smell of fresh coffee made the stark contrast between their two lives even more apparent. James looked at Mark, who still seemed hesitant, as though he didn't quite belong there. The sight broke James's heart. "So, what happened, Nit?" James finally asked, leaning forward. "How did you end up here?" Mark took a deep breath, his fingers wrapping tightly around the coffee cup, as if the warmth was grounding him. "It wasn't one thing," he began slowly. "It was a lot of things that went wrong, one after the other. I lost my job a few years back when the company downsized. I tried to find something else, but nothing stuck. Then I got sick. Had to spend most of my savings on medical bills. It all just spiraled. Before I knew it, I was evicted. No job, no money, nowhere to go." James listened intently, each word sinking deeper into his chest. Mark had always been the strong one, the guy who had it all together. To hear him talk about his struggles with such quiet acceptance was heartbreaking. "I didn't want to reach out," Mark continued, staring into his cup. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this. I've been staying at the shelter for a few months now, just trying to figure things out. But it's hard, man. It's really hard." James felt a lump form in his throat again. He had been living in luxury, surrounded by success, while his best friend had been fighting for survival. The guilt gnawed at him, but more than that, a fierce sense of determination started to build within him. He wasn't going to let Mark face this alone anymore. "Why didn't you reach out?" James asked softly. "I would have helped, you know that." Mark shook his head. "I couldn't, James. I couldn't let you see me like this. It's embarrassing." James reached across the table, placing a hand on Mark's arm. "There's nothing to be embarrassed about," he said firmly. "We've all had hard times. I'm just sorry I wasn't there for you sooner." Mark looked at James, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of years apart hanging between them. Finally, James broke the silence with a question that had been on his mind since the moment he saw Mark. "What do you need right now?" Mark blinked, as if the question took him by surprise. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm just trying to survive, I guess. I never thought I'd be here." James nodded, his mind already working through a plan. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future, and Mark wasn't going to do this alone anymore. "We'll figure this out," James said, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out together." Mark looked at him, and for the first time since they had reunited, James saw a glimmer of hope in his old friend's eyes. James couldn't sleep that night. His conversation with Mark replayed over and over in his mind, each detail gnawing at him. He had never imagined that someone like Mark, smart, capable, and full of life, could end up in such a dire situation. He felt a deep, aching guilt, as though he had somehow failed his old friend. All the success, the wealth, the power he had accumulated over the years, it suddenly felt meaningless in the face of what Mark was going through. The next morning, James woke up with a sense of clarity. He knew he had to do more than just offer words of comfort. He couldn't let Mark return to the shelter, not when he had the means to help him. But it wasn't just about money. It was about giving Mark the chance to rebuild, to find his footing again. As soon as the sun rose, James called Mark. His voice was filled with a determination that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I've been thinking," he began, not giving Mark much of a chance to speak. "I don't want you to stay at that shelter anymore. I've got plenty of room at my place, and it's just sitting there empty. Come stay with me." Mark was silent on the other end for a moment, clearly taken aback by the offer. "James, I can't just move in with you. That's too much. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," James said, his tone firm but kind. "You're my friend, and friends don't let friends go through stuff like this alone. Please let me help, at least until you get back on your feet." There was another pause. James could tell that Mark was struggling with his pride, with the weight of accepting such a large gesture. It wasn't easy for someone who had always been independent, who had taken care of himself for so long, to accept help. "I don't know, James." Mark's voice was hesitant. "I appreciate the offer, but I've been managing on my own for a while now. It feels strange to accept something like this." James sighed, understanding where Mark was coming from. "You've been surviving, Mark, but that's not living. I know it's hard to accept help, but think of this as temporary, just until we figure things out. I promise it's not charity. It's just me wanting to be there for a friend." For a long moment, the phone line was filled with nothing but silence. James waited, hoping that Mark would say yes, hoping that he could finally do something to make things right. Finally, Mark let out a soft sigh. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I'll give it a try, but just for a little while." James smiled, relief flooding through him. "Great, I'll come pick you up." Later that day, James drove over to the shelter to pick Mark up. The drive there felt surreal, as if he were crossing some invisible line between two different worlds, his life of affluence and comfort, and the harsh reality of Mark's current existence. The shelter was a small, run-down building on the outskirts of the city, its walls weathered and its windows cracked. As James pulled up, he felt a pang of discomfort at how far removed his life had become from places like this. Mark was waiting outside, a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked uncomfortable, out of place even in the shelter's surroundings, and as James pulled up, Mark gave him a sheepish wave. The contrast between the sleek, expensive car and Mark's worn-out appearance was jarring, but James didn't care about appearances. As Mark slid into the passenger seat, James glanced over at him and smiled. "Ready to get out of here?" Mark gave a small nod, though he still seemed uneasy. "Yeah, ready as I'll ever be." The drive back to James' penthouse was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. James could sense Mark's discomfort growing as they neared the wealthier part of the city, the towering buildings and luxury cars surrounding them a stark contrast to the shelter's neighborhood. When they finally pulled into the underground parking garage of James's building, Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wow," he muttered under his breath. "This place is something else." James chuckled, though there was a trace of awkwardness in his laughter. "Yeah, it's a bit much sometimes, but it's home." They rode the elevator up to the top floor, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. When the elevator doors opened to reveal the massive expanse of James's penthouse, Mark hesitated at the threshold. His eyes scanned the luxurious surroundings, the polished marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city, the sleek, modern furniture that screamed wealth and power. "I don't know if I belong here," Mark said quietly, almost to himself. James turned to face him, his expression serious. "Of course you do," he said firmly. "You're my friend, and you're always welcome here. It's just a place, Mark. What matters is that you're here now, and we're going to figure this out together." Mark took a deep breath and finally stepped inside, his duffel bag hanging loosely from his shoulder. As they walked through the penthouse, James gave him a quick tour, though he could tell that Mark was still overwhelmed by the sheer opulence of the place. It was clear that Mark felt out of place, as though he didn't belong in a space so filled with luxury. And James couldn't blame him. It was a far cry from the world Mark had been living in. After showing him to the guest room, James clapped Mark on the shoulder. "Make yourself at home. Stay as long as you need to. I've got meetings for the rest of the day, but we'll grab dinner later and talk some more, all right?" Mark gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, James. I mean it." James returned the smile and nodded before heading out, leaving Mark alone in the vast apartment. As James walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but think about how strange it was to see his old friend in such a vulnerable state. But he was determined to make things right, no matter what it took. For the next few days, Mark stayed mostly quiet, adjusting slowly to his new surroundings. James could sense the discomfort in him, the way he moved through the penthouse as though he didn't quite belong. It wasn't until the fourth evening that Mark finally opened up a little more. They sat together in the living room, sharing a quiet dinner as the city lights twinkled outside the windows. Mark had been picking at his food, lost in thought, before he finally spoke. I don't know how to do this," Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been living on my own for so long, scraping by, that I don't know how to accept help without feeling like I'm failing." James looked at him, his expression empathetic. "You're not failing, Mark. Life can knock any of us down. It's not about whether you need help. It's about whether you're willing to let people be there for you when you do. You'd do the same for me if the roles were reversed." Mark nodded, though James could see the internal struggle still waging within him. "It's just hard," Mark admitted. "I never thought I'd end up like this, and now that I'm here, living in your world, I feel like I don't deserve it." "You deserve more than this," James said, his voice filled with conviction. "And we're going to work on getting you back to where you should be. But for now, just take it one day at a time. Let yourself breathe for once." Mark gave a small, hesitant smile, the first genuine one James had seen since their reunion. "All right, one day at a time." Over the next few weeks, Mark began to relax a little more, his guard slowly coming down. The days were filled with long talks, laughter, and moments that reminded them both of the friendship they had shared all those years ago. James made it a point to help Mark in practical ways, setting up meetings with job counselors and even introducing him to some of his business contacts. But more than that, James offered Mark something he had been missing for far too long: support, compassion, and a sense of belonging. And slowly but surely, Mark began to feel like himself again. The journey ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, Mark didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The weeks turned into months, and as time passed, Mark began to settle into a routine that felt more stable than anything he had experienced in years. It wasn't just about living in James's luxurious penthouse, though the comfort and security of having a roof over his head helped ease his anxiety. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, he had someone in his corner, someone who believed in him and wanted to see him succeed. James had gone out of his way to make Mark feel welcome, not just in his home but in his life. He hadn't just offered a place to stay, he had offered his time, his resources, and most importantly, his friendship. Every day James reminded Mark that he wasn't alone. Whether it was through small gestures, like taking Mark out for coffee or inviting him along to networking events, or the larger steps they were taking to rebuild Mark's career, James was committed to seeing his old friend succeed. One of the first things James did was introduce Mark to a career coach, someone who specialized in helping people transition back into the workforce after facing setbacks. The coach was kind, understanding, and worked with Mark to not only update his resume but also rebuild his confidence. Mark had spent so long scraping by, feeling as though he had nothing left to offer the world, that it took time for him to see himself as capable again. At first, the sessions were difficult. Mark found it hard to talk about his past, about the downward spiral that had led him to the shelter. Every time he was asked about his skills, his experience, or his goals for the future, he felt a wave of shame wash over him. What goals could he possibly have? He had spent so many years just trying to survive that dreaming about the future seemed almost foreign. But the coach was patient, and so was James. Slowly, Mark began to open up. He started to remember the things he was good at, the talents he had once taken pride in. He had a knack for problem solving, a sharp analytical mind, and a creative side that had always made him stand out in his old job. Piece by piece, the fragments of the person Mark used to be began to come together, and with that, so did his confidence. It wasn't just the career coaching that helped Mark regain his footing. James was there every step of the way, encouraging him to take care of himself, both physically and mentally. He signed Mark up for a health program at a local wellness center, where he could receive medical attention and begin addressing some of the health issues that had plagued him for years. The first few visits were tough, but with each appointment, Mark started to feel stronger, more capable. It was as though his body was slowly catching up to the hope that had begun to blossom inside him. As Mark's health improved, so did his outlook on life. He no longer felt like the world was crushing him. Each small victory, a good doctor's report, a positive session with his career coach, or even just a productive day, felt like a step forward. And with each step, the old Mark, the one who had once been full of ambition and drive, began to resurface. James noticed the change almost immediately. There was a new light in Mark's eyes, a spark that hadn't been there when they first reunited. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. Mark was beginning to thrive. He started talking about ideas, about possibilities, and for the first time in years, James saw his friend dreaming again. One evening, as they sat in the living room discussing life over dinner, James brought up an idea that had been brewing in his mind for a while. "You know," James began, casually sipping his drink, "I've been thinking about something." Mark looked up from his plate, curious. "What's that?" "Well," James continued, "do you remember that business idea we talked about back in high school? The one about starting our own consulting firm?" Mark chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You remember that? We were just kids back then, dreaming about changing the world." James nodded, a smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, but we had some good ideas, and I've been thinking maybe it's time we give it a shot." Mark blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What do you mean? You're already running a successful company. Why would you want to start something new?" James leaned forward, his eyes filled with excitement. "Because I believe in you, Mark. I've seen what you're capable of, and I know that together we could build something great. You have the skills, the knowledge, and most importantly, you have the drive. You just need someone to believe in you again." Mark stared at James, his heart racing. The idea sounded too good to be true. After everything he had been through, the thought of starting his own business, of building something from the ground up, felt overwhelming. But at the same time, it sparked something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. "You really think we could do it?" Mark asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "I know we can," James replied confidently. "Look, I'm not asking you to jump in all at once. We can take it slow, build it up together. You'll have my support every step of the way. But I'm telling you, Mark, this is your shot. This is your chance to turn everything around." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For so long he had been stuck in survival mode, just trying to get by. Now, for the first time in years, he was being offered an opportunity to not just survive, but to succeed. "I don't know, James," Mark said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "It feels like a lot. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like this." James smiled, his gaze steady. "You don't have to be ready all at once. We'll take it one step at a time, just like we've been doing. But I'm telling you, Mark, this is your time. I believe in you. and I think it's time you start believing in yourself too. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. James had already laid the groundwork for the business, and now he and Mark were working together to bring it to life. At first, Mark was hesitant, unsure of how he could contribute. But as they began to hash out the details, something inside him clicked. The old Mark, the one who had always been quick on his feet and sharp with ideas, started to re-emerge. He threw himself into the work, coming up with strategies, making connections, and slowly but surely, the consulting firm began to take shape. It wasn't easy. There were long days, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt. But through it all, Mark felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. But just as things were beginning to look up, they hit their first major setback. One of the firm's early clients, a big fish that James had pulled in, suddenly pulled out of their deal. It was a blow to the fledgling business, one that left both James and Mark reeling. Mark, in particular, felt the sting of failure. The doubts that had been lurking at the edges of his mind came rushing back in full force. What if this was a mistake? What if he wasn't cut out for this after all? The night the deal fell through, Mark sat in the penthouse living room, staring blankly at the city lights outside. James found him there, slumped in the armchair, a look of defeat on his face. "We lost them," Mark said quietly, not even looking up as James entered the room. "It's over." James sat down next to him, his expression calm, though his own disappointment was clear. "It's not over," he said, his voice steady. "We hit a bump. It happens. But this isn't the end." Mark shook his head. "You don't get it, James. I don't belong in this world. I've been fooling myself. I don't know what I'm doing, and now we've lost our biggest client. I should have never gotten involved." James leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "Listen to me. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. There were always going to be setbacks. But that doesn't mean we stop. This is part of the process. You're not failing. You're learning." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Learning? It feels like I'm just screwing everything up." James reached over and placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "You're not screwing anything up. This is just one setback. We'll get through it, just like we've gotten through everything else. But you've got to trust yourself. You're not the man I found sitting outside that shelter anymore, Mark. You've come so far. Don't let this knock you down." Mark looked at James, the words sinking in slowly. He had come far, hadn't he? He wasn't that broken man anymore. He had been rebuilding himself piece by piece, and one failure didn't define him. Maybe this was just another part of the journey, another obstacle to overcome. "All right," Mark said quietly. "We'll figure it out." James smiled, a look of relief passing over his face. "That's the spirit. Now let's get back to work." The next few days were tough. They had to scramble to make up for the lost deal, and there were moments when Mark felt the weight of everything bearing down on him. But slowly, things started to turn around. They brought in a few smaller clients, and while it wasn't the big win they had hoped for, it was enough to keep them going. Mark's confidence, shaken by the setback, began to build again, and this time, it felt stronger. He was learning to navigate the challenges, to push through the moments of doubt, and with every small success, he felt a little more sure of himself. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above his past, that he could succeed, despite everything he had been through. And with James by his side, Mark knew he wasn't facing any of it alone. Months passed, and Mark's life continued to transform in ways he had never thought possible. The consulting business that he and James had started was gaining traction. What had once seemed like a pipe dream, a wild idea born out of late-night conversations during their high school days, was now becoming a thriving reality. Mark had thrown himself into the work, channeling all of his energy into growing the business, and his efforts were paying off. With each new client, Mark's confidence grew. He had rediscovered his sharp mind, his ability to think creatively, and his talent for problem-solving. The doubts that had once plagued him, the thoughts that he wasn't good enough or that he didn't belong in this world, began to fade. Instead, they were replaced by a sense of purpose, a belief that he could succeed, not just because of James's support, but because of his own skills and hard work. The setbacks they had faced earlier, including the loss of that major client, now seemed like distant memories. They had learned from their mistakes, adjusted their strategies, and grown stronger as a result. Mark found that with each challenge they overcame, his fear of failure diminished. He was no longer the man who had been living in a shelter, afraid of what the future held. He was someone new, someone who had fought his way back from the bottom and was now thriving. But beyond the business success, it was the personal growth that meant the most to Mark. For so long, he had felt like he was drifting through life, disconnected and alone. He had been haunted by the feeling that he had nothing to offer, that his best days were behind him. Now, standing on the other side of that darkness, he realized just how wrong he had been. One afternoon, as he and James were going over some paperwork in the office, Mark took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. He looked across the desk at James, who was focused on a document in front of him, scribbling notes in the margins. The sight of James sitting there, so calm and confident, made Mark smile. "What's up?" James asked, glancing up from his work and catching Mark's smile. "Just thinking," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "It's crazy how far we've come, isn't it? From that first coffee at the cafe to now, it doesn't even feel real sometimes." James grinned, setting down his pen. "Yeah, it's been one hell of a journey, but I knew we could do it. I always knew you had it in you." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "I didn't. Not back then. I was a mess when you found me." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "You weren't a mess. You were going through a rough time, but you were never a mess. I saw who you really were, even then. You just needed someone to remind you." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He thought back to that day outside the shelter when he had been at his lowest point. He had been so close to giving up, so convinced that his life was over. And then James had shown up, offering not just a place to stay, but a lifeline. Without James, none of this would have been possible. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I've said that enough. I owe you everything, James. You saved me." James shook his head, his smile warm. "You don't owe me anything. All I did was remind you of who you are. The rest? That was all you." Mark wanted to argue, to insist that James had done so much more than that, but he could see in James's eyes that his friend genuinely believed it. And maybe, in a way, he was right. Mark had done the work. He had pushed through the doubts, the fear, the setbacks. He had fought for this new life. But none of it would have been possible without James's faith in him. The months continued to pass, and soon, their consulting firm was no longer just a small operation. It had grown into something much larger than either of them had anticipated. They had built a strong reputation in the industry, and clients were beginning to seek them out, impressed by the results they delivered and the personal touch they brought to their work. One afternoon, Mark sat in his office going over the quarterly reports. The numbers were staggering. They had exceeded every projection, every goal they had set for themselves. It was a moment that should have been filled with pure joy, but as Mark stared at the reports, he felt something else, a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He thought back to the man he had been a year ago, lost, hopeless, sitting on a bench outside a shelter, wondering if he would ever get his life back. The contrast between then and now was almost too much to comprehend. How had he gone from there to here? It seemed impossible, yet here he was, living a life that felt more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined. That evening, after the workday had ended, Mark and James decided to celebrate. They went out to a quiet bar they both liked, and over drinks, they reminisced about the journey they had been on. The bar was cozy, with soft lighting and the hum of conversation in the background, creating a perfect atmosphere for reflection. Mark looked at his drink, swirling the liquid around the glass before speaking. "You know, there were times when I didn't think I'd make it out of that shelter," he admitted, his voice low. "I had given up on myself, but you didn't. I don't know why, but you didn't." James sipped his drink and set the glass down, meeting Mark's eyes. "Because I knew who you really were," he said simply, "and I wasn't going to let you give up on yourself." Mark smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "I wish I could have seen what you saw. It took me so long to believe I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving," James replied. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of that." Mark nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. He had been lucky, so incredibly lucky, to have James in his life, but more than that, he had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way back. It wasn't easy. It took time, effort, and the support of people who cared, but there was always hope. As they sat there, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was no longer defined by his past. He wasn't the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had rebuilt his life, who had fought his way back from the brink, and who had emerged stronger because of it. A few weeks later, Mark found himself back at the shelter, not as a resident, but as a volunteer. James had suggested it as a way to give back, to help others who were going through what Mark had experienced. At first, Mark had been hesitant. The thought of returning to the place where he had once been at his lowest was daunting. But as he stood there, handing out meals and talking to the people who came through the doors, he realized just how far he had come. One afternoon, as he was serving lunch, a man approached him. He was younger than Mark, but his eyes were filled with the same kind of weariness that Mark had once carried. The man looked down at the food in his hands, then up at Mark, his expression a mixture of gratitude and despair. "Thanks," the man said quietly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I feel like I'm stuck, like there's no way out." Mark paused, his heart tightening at the familiar words. He had been there. He had felt that same hopelessness, that same belief that there was no way out. But now, standing on the other side of it, he knew better. "There is a way out," Mark said softly, meeting the man's eyes. "It's not easy, and it takes time, but you can get through this. I know it feels impossible right now, but I promise you, things can get better." The man looked at him, clearly skeptical. "How do you know?" Mark smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Because I was where you are not that long ago, and I made it out. You can too." The man stared at him for a long moment, his expression shifting from disbelief to something softer, something almost hopeful. He nodded slowly, taking in Mark's words, before turning and walking away with his meal. As Mark watched him go, he felt a sense of fulfillment that was deeper than any business success or financial gain could ever provide. He had made it out of the darkness, and now he could help others do the same. That evening, as he walked back to the penthouse, the city lights twinkling around him, Mark reflected on the incredible journey he had been on. It had been a journey of failure and loss, of doubt and despair, but also of redemption, hope and renewal. He had learned that even when life seemed to have beaten you down, there was always a way back up. And he had learned that no matter how dark things got, the people who cared about you could help light the way. When he reached the penthouse, James was waiting for him, a look of curiosity on his face. "How did it go?" he asked. Mark smiled, a deep, contented smile. "It went well," he said. "It felt good to give back, to be on the other side of things." James nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "I'm glad. You've come a long way, Mark. I hope you know that." Mark looked at his friend. the man who had believed in him when no one else did and felt a surge of gratitude. "I do," he said quietly, "and I wouldn't have made it without you." James waved the sentiment away, though there was warmth in his smile. "You would have figured it out. I just gave you a little nudge." They both knew it had been more than a nudge, but Mark didn't argue. Instead, he let the moment hang between them, the weight of their friendship and everything they had been through settling into a comfortable silence. As they sat there, side by side, Mark realized that his journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, always obstacles to face. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had rebuilt his life, and now he had the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what came next. And with James by his side, Mark knew that anything was possible.